And we'll get into it here, but I wonder if should give some sort of disclosure. It's kind of like a nerdy philosophical topic
Yeah,
when you
yeah,
get into um, objective morality, relativism, subjectivism, nihilism, these things. I was wondering, maybe just as a question, I'm curious your thoughts. It's like we tend to skip over this idea. Like there's a book I like, the Big Book of Virtues or something like that.
yeah.
It's
William
something
Dennett.
like that. Huh?
William Dennett, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, it's like 500 pages or so, or something like that. It's not a small book,
Hmm.
but it kind of jumps over this idea. It's coming from the perspective that you've already adopted, that there's true good and beautiful moral objectivism is a thing. And I kind of
Hmm.
get why. It's a little bit of a tricky tricky topic
Yeah.
to get into. But yeah, what comes to mind initially to kick us off?
Well, I think it's important because I think it's especially important now because it's not taken for granted anymore. That idea of that there is a an actual objective morality is no longer taken for granted. It's not an assumption that there is a right and wrong or a better or worse, that there are these true virtues. Um, and without that assumption in society, that kind of leads to a lack of connection, leads to a lot of anxiety, a lot of feeling lost, a lot of the rabbit hole of rationalizing each decision that you want to do, like we kind of talked about last time. So I think it's really important to put our thumb on this question, hopefully do it in a way that's really accessible, but because when you just skip over it and take it for granted that, yes, there is virtue, right, wrong, and everything, then um, you kind of lose half the audience already because they're like,
Yeah,
I don't take this for granted, right? That so I think it does um, bear giving a good argument for why you should care about
yeah,
virtues, why there actually might be a right and wrong.
yeah. And sometimes I think, like with a lot of topics, maybe we're on a spectrum in terms of how much we're, you know, really behind it. And
Hmm.
there are some aspects where like I can fall into maybe a bit of moral skepticism, or it honestly, I don't know if we'll be able to unpack it. Hopefully we can, but it gets muddy for me. Like let me an example. I was trying to think of how do I explain this, but you know how there's the idea that it's like it's neither good nor bad. Say in stoicism, this idea, it's like something happens to you, it's it's okay. It's not things that upset us, but it's how we think about them.
Sure.
Like there is this like truth to that type of thing shows up, the term neither good nor bad. um so
That's
that
judgment. That's placing
y-
judgment on like kind
yeah,
of fortune is a good way of I think you can kind of compartmentalize these things.
yeah.
Um, for example, like if I there's an old Zen saying that's fairly similar. It's like the kids, um, the, this guy's son, falls off a horse and breaks his leg, and they're like, "Oh, that's bad," and the guy says maybe, and then the next day, like there's this guy who comes in and is trying to enlist people for this war, and his son didn't have to go because he has a broken leg. And someone says, "Oh, what good fortune," and he says, "Maybe." And it's back and forth, and so yeah, when we're talking about fortune, there's this yeah, it's good, bad. That those judgments are probably not so useful. Um, I think you can draw a line though. and say, like, when we're talking about ethics, or morality, things that your impact uh, uh, on the world around you, um, then you can say that there's a better and worse. It, it, per, at least when you get more extreme, you can see it. It's really obvious. Like, should I, um, when I'm, should I steal this person's car, kill them, steal this person's car just because I want it, or deal with the fact that I don't have the money for this car, and I don't have this car, and not
Yeah.
kill this person for their car. It's like, which is better? It's
Yeah.
obvious, right? So I think that you can draw a line and say, like, okay, fortune is different. Speaking about events and fortune, whether it's good or bad, with the things that are happening to us in our life. Um,
Y-
it probably doesn't do a lot of good to say to judge good versus bad. But when you're talking about ethical decisions, behaviors, you could call them good or bad. You might just say whether they contribute. If you want to get away from ethics, you might even just say whether they contribute to your to human fulfillment or not. Um, Whether they are positive towards for utilities to society, however you want to look at it, if you were a utilitarian. um, but whether they contribute to human flourishing, or make human flourishing less likely. um,
Yeah.
but I think you can make that distinction.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And hopefully we can set up a couple throughout the conversation, a couple parameters and lines and distinctions and things like that. Um, but even in the way like on this particular point, I love the parable. Maybe yes, maybe no. Um,
Yeah.
but the even in the term of ethics, if you do some sort of ethical transgression against me, for me, neither good nor bad. It's like, and they're coming from the perspective of it's neither good nor bad because it didn't harm your character. But on your end, like the person committing some sort of ethical wrongdoing, it's not exactly the case. So it's like it's this
Yes.
weird, yeah. That gets like tricky to me in the way of like you talked about the word judgment, great word, and the Stoics are talking about that in judgment, but there's some sort of like flexibility in thinking, like cognitive flexibility that is required around this. And I've
Absolutely.
seen a lot of debates, and I've seen, there are many people that make the case for some sort of moral skepticism. Like, interestingly, we were chatting before we hit record. I sent you a video by a guy named Kaplan, this philosophy professor, and I found it interesting. He said something, if I heard him correctly, that the majority of his students, like these people that are taking a, philosophy 101 course, he would categorize them as moral, skeptics, or in this idea of subjectivism, that it
Mm.
depends. And it's I found that interesting because it's, maybe I'm bringing in too many things here, but even in the thing of like from a Christian perspective, even in the way of some sort of ethical wrongdoing, there's the judgment from another perspective of me not judging you. Me, instead of like judgment towards you as an individual, like forgiveness and compassion. Me, the common well-known scripture thing of pointing out the speck in someone else's eye, while there's a log in mine. So it
Yeah.
gets like these type of things, it gets a bit tricky.
And you're right. Cognitive flexibility is a great word. I actually wrote a Substack post on that very well. I use a large chunk of it was going into that very verse. because
Nice.
and I kind of point out that you know just after this is comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, and shortly after that, Jesus makes the comment, but you so don't judge. Take the log out of your eye before pointing out the speck in your whatever. And then, so I shouldn't whatever, but I can't
Yeah.
quote as well as many others could. Um, and but shortly after that, he says, um, "Don't throw your pearls to pigs," which is which is saying um, that you need to be able to judge who is a pig. I mean, inherent in that statement is so he says, literally a line later, he says, don't focus on the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in yours. And then a line later, don't throw your pearls to pigs, which requires you to have the ability to judge who is a pig, who is not going to, basically be able to, um, you know, or, you know, it's kind of like the you're the average of the five people you hang out with the most is kind of what Jesus is alluding to there. So you have to be able to judge who's going to support you in this path or not. So you're right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cognitive flexibility required here.
Yeah.
The ability to note that at the same time I might not want to judge others, but I need to be able to see in others what behaviors aren't fruitful that I don't want to continue and fall in myself. And I need to be able to see in others, like, you're on this path that is very destructive to society. All right. And I don't want to support you in that path. And like, even if I care about you, I might have to, caring about you might be part of caring about you might be helping lead you away from that path. Like, if I care about you, I don't let you steal, because I care about you and I think you're better than that. I'm going to help try to turn you away from that sort of behavior, which requires judgment, which is
y-
based off of a sense of moral objectivism.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, on that spectrum, it makes me think of like some of the terms that come up around this are relativism. You think of like cultural relativism, subjectivism, but then like related would be nihilism. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's like sometimes I think of that pearls and swine idea of like someone that is seeing like inherently evil as the capital G good. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like this different thing in terms of that is a
Sure.
much bigger move from the like seeing the opposite of this moral objectivism, true good and beautiful. There's a lot of movement in the in the way of going from there, but not so much in the way sometimes of like a cultural relativism or this subjectivism type of stuff. um that, like, to me sometimes is a could just be just like a slight shift in um perspective, like a slight shift um in a way of looking at it. To me, I don't know, like, any thoughts of like how we get from a subjectivism type of worldview closer to, I hate to keep saying these long philosophical words, but closer to a let me say true good and beautiful this time.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, right?
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
like you said, there's these big words, and you know, just to clarify for anyone listening, cultural relativism, moral relativism, subjectivism. Just to simplify this idea, it's this idea that you do your thing, I'll do mine. But more than that, like, and it's all just as good. Like, who am I to judge you? Who are you to judge me? There's no better and worse. Um, you know, you know, it's really the sense that there is no better or worse.
yeah,
Um, and I think you have to be able to separate things politically and morally too. Like, you could be a libertarian, that thinks that politically the government shouldn't tell you what to do, but also be like a devout religious person who thinks that, but there is a right and wrong. So the government shouldn't step in to say that, and but potentially, um, you should have that compass yourself and work that out with your creator, whatever it is. I think what's helpful is to get us there is to see like why society has drifted, as you alluded to earlier. You said that the professor Kaplan, his assertion was that most of his students were moral subjectivists, meaning they thought that there was no true good and beautiful, basically, or at least not objective beautiful. Nothing that was objectively good. That it was all relative. Your choice, your taste. It's basically your morality could be based on taste. And like, who are you to tell me that it is wrong for me to, let's, at the risk of coming off very poorly, but who are you to tell me it's wrong for me to have sexual relations with an animal, right? Like who are you to tell me anything is wrong? It's not hurting you, so there's kind of this sense
Yeah.
in society. And there's a great book, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, where he goes through these, and typically university educated students really lean that way, where they lean towards he has all these surveys he gave out to his students. For example, one question is, if you and your sister, you're both in your 20s, and you go off and you decide that you're going to have relations with each other. You use protection. There's nothing comes of it. Afterwards you decide that was fun, but you're not going to do it again, and your relationship is not hurt or anything else. Like, is it wrong? And like 97% of university students that he polled were basically said no. And that flies in the face of a lot of like religious worldviews and ethical traditions of the past. So like we've really seen this drift toward moral relativism, and especially I have an example of that myself. When I basically posed a question of how do we know if something's better or worse to a class, a team leadership class, trying to get just a dialogue started. And very, unanimously, the class was trying to tell me there is no such thing as better or worse. And I live in Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is, the most religious area in the country, I just saw. And like all these
Yeah.
students are telling me, oh, no, there is no such thing as better or worse. I'm like, so if I go punch your baby sister, it's not better to not punch than it is to punch a baby sister. So that's kind of what has gone on. And to go a step further, are you familiar with moralistic therapeutic deism?
No, never heard of it.
It's a really interesting. So in the late '90s, early 2000s, there was a. It's at Notre Dame now. I think it was at North Carolina at the time. A professor who did a global study calling teens across the nation to give them a survey to figure out what was the most common religious beliefs of the United States. All right, and so he gave them all these tests, and though they all, the majority, like over 80%, claimed to be Christians, through his surveys, he came to the conclusion that they weren't, by their actual beliefs. They claimed to be Christian, but by their actual beliefs, they weren't. In his opinion, they were what he called moralistic therapeutic deists, which basically, as he defined it, was like they thought that there was a God who wanted them to be happy, and wanted them to basically try to be a good person. But what that meant, that there weren't really any requirements that came with that. So you can see this is kind of a step in that direction. This is the late '90s, early 2000s, and like so, even the religious belief is shifting towards like there's not a lot of requirements. Just kind of be nice to everybody, and guess what? There's a God who wants you to be happy, and He's going to take care of you, and you can call on when you want something, and like Santa Claus, he's gonna try to answer, and so you can see that step towards moral relativism, right? And I think that that's the kind of the context that we're bringing this conversation into today. Um, is
Yeah.
why did that shift happen in American society, and Western society more broadly, right? Um, I
Yeah.
think that has to be addressed first, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about it in the way of this character lab series, half a dozen episodes we're going to do. I'll put a link in the show notes if anybody didn't catch the first episode, which was kind of a broad introduction. Um, but I was thinking about, we have this rough outline that I can't quite remember all the way forward, but the next episode is who's your Socrates, all about role models. But I was thinking about how like this idea influences like all the rest. If there is no sort of better or worse, like in the words of talking with young students and things like that, that's going to influence in the way of like what's the need for a role model? Like what's the need for some sort of you know uh person's life or highest good. It's just kind of the rest is not even needed. And maybe you could say in the way of character development, what is character development a thing without the notion of true good and beautiful or better and worse?
Yeah. So, and that's a tough one. I wonder. I I want to say two things. First of all, um, Professor Kaplan's assertion, which I tend to lean towards, is that uh, a lot of people claim to be moral subjectivists, but if you question them long enough, no one is.
Yeah.
Uh,
Was Auschwitz good or bad? Yeah.
Everyone's got something, and they might, because they know they're in a kind of a theoretical situation. They might give you the answer. Well, we can't say whether it was good or bad, but then like these same people are going to have their pet issues, and they're going to be morally appalled at you when you're not sympathetic to the plight of these people, or you don't care about climate change, or whatever it might be. Like they will have something that they fervently in their to their very core um, believe in, and think ill of you that you don't share that belief, right? So and this is, everyone can kind of play that game and see this in their experiences, right? Whether someone says they're moral relativist or not, like they don't actually think everything is just as good. They do make ethical judgments in their day-to-day life. They do decide, like, it's whether their decision is it's bad to spank your kids, or it's bad to let your kids rule the world and do whatever they want without consequences. Like, we all have these judgments deep in our bones.
Yeah.
And you can debate where that comes from, but like the reality is, no one in practice is an actual moral relativist. And I think that's important to note. No
Hmm.
one in practice is an actual moral relativist. So
Hmm.
we are all picking some sort of moral code, uh, and it might be a lot looser with a lot less constraints, but we all kind of have something. So it's worthwhile thinking about, like, if you're gonna have one anyway, like what should it be, and why does it exist,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Um, the in the you could say that it's an evolutionary a quirk of evolution, which Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind goes into great detail on that, and kind of makes the case that morality is a human superpower. It is what is allowed, you know, uh, the human species to dominate the world. It is what allows us to cooperate at massive scale. If it wasn't for shared morality, like, then there's no way that humans could have, had civilization as we know it. This is what allows us to kind of have common guardrails and boundaries, so that humans can flourish. Um, you know, a lot of people, you know, on all sides, on all issues, any political issue that you see, they're tending to make a moral argument. Whether that's, we should take care of the future by, being less dependent on oil, and more carbon neutral, be kinder to animals. Like, these are all moral arguments. Or whether it's, saying, like, like, you shouldn't have an abortion in the final term. Like, that's a moral argument. So immigrants should be allowed, they shouldn't be allowed, illegal immigrants. So it's like it's kind of all over the place there. These are all moral arguments, and I think like, I'd be curious to hear your opinion. Um, does it really matter whether there's a real, um, and I have my biases here, but does it really matter if there's a real, like, moral truth, or if it's just like what promotes human flourishing? Do
Yeah.
you get what I'm saying there? Like, does it actually matter? Because it's really kind of impossible to say. Like, do our intuitions about right and wrong, do they come from a higher being, um,
Yeah.
or are they evolutionarily produced, and irrespective of a higher being, or is it a combination of the two? You could go all these different ways. At the end of the day, like, if we can't know, if you just understand the function of morality throughout time and how it's been essential to human flourishing, doesn't that mean you should care about it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a difficult thing. Surprisingly, I think I think a little bit about this in the way of I think I put a question is like, is character formation really what through much of history, like, we called spiritual formation? Is
Mm-hmm.
it, is the adoption of moral objectivism, like, there is this, like, capital G good, um around, moral behavior, moral excellence.
Mm-hmm.
Do you need to believe in a creator, like, that these came from somewhere? And sometimes I waffle on that, but
Mm-hmm.
I do think, like, in the way of two options. Like, one, because, like, if we are going to adopt that, well, then the next, like, question is, okay, well, what are they? What are those, behaviors that are in the category of moral excellence? Because then you got to kind of drill it down and get a bit specific. But, like, I don't typically think in the way of, like, evolutionary, but I mean, you could use that word as well. And, like, the throughout, like, the arc of history, like, wisdom traditions, like, C.S. Lewis uses the term uh Tao, like, the way, like, across traditions, what are the common set of virtues that we all um believe in? And he says, like, that it's really a law of human nature. For in this book, The Abolition of Man, which I have a quote that I want to get to from that, which was, I don't know when it was initially published. I can't remember, but many, many, many decades ago.
Yeah, I think it was like the 19 teens or 1920s. He was
Was
he,
it?
he was taking the Green Book, which was the educational
Yeah,
book. Yeah.
yeah. But I was thinking in the way of so it's like, he uses, I think, law of human nature, and he's saying it's just like the law of gravity. Maybe we touched on this last conversation. I apologize if we get a little bit redundant in this, but I think it may be helpful as well to hear some things touched on again. But it's like, just like the law of gravity, except we don't actually have to follow it. I was thinking in a way of an analogy of writing. Like, I put out these like daily emails, and there's specific, like basic, grammar rules. Like you capitalize the first letter in each sentence, to use like a simple example. That's essentially a law. It's a writing rule. Um, I don't have to follow that. You and I could make a pact right now. Hey, we're done with capitalizing the first letter in every sentence. And it's like we can do that. But it's like he's making the case in some sort of way. It's like, yeah, there is this way. We know inherently, just like you were talking about, we're not, even though we might call ourselves, and in some aspects, we're moral relativists, but if someone robs our house when we go to work, we generally deem that in the category of that was bad. That was, how could someone do that?
Sure.
Um, and he points to a lot of these things, and I know you have young kids like I do. I notice that in the way of young kids, of they know when there's some sort of unfair act or some sort of thing. It's like
Hmm.
we are kind of wired a little bit, and not saying that we can't be influenced towards the direction of darkness and evil, but it seems like naturally we have some sort of insight around, what is good and what is bad, around, you know moral behavior. But
Hmm.
yeah, I kind of go back and forth. It seems like it's a much easier move in the way of adopting a particular religious tradition, in the way of, this came down in the way of this
Yeah.
and that, or there's some sort of like creator, even in the way of stoicism and different like philosophical things, Socrates, Plato. These are people that were, maybe they weren't, Christians, because obviously it's kind of before that time, or with the Stoics, maybe kind of right around the time of Jesus and things like that. But they are people that believe in God. Sometimes it's gods, in the way of plural, but it's like some of this stuff is coming from outside of them. They are not the seeing themselves as the center of the universe type of thing.
Yeah, and that's kind of the, I guess, the argument of C.S. Lewis, right? That these intuitions, they come from somewhere. That all civilizations throughout time have had certain intuitions, and they come from somewhere. They're put in there from somewhere. It's really a deeply Christian idea that there is um, that there's a relationship with God. There's and so that you are able to discern right and wrong through these feelings, through these this sort of connection. Like you actually have a conscience that determines right or wrong. Um, and and so yeah, that's what he called the Tao. Um, I think there's kind of different ways you can go here, that people can get lost in. There is a sense of dogma, like give me the rules. These rules come from on high, right, wrong, like strict
Yeah.
binary, like yes or no. Um, and then there's what I think is a better view, if you're just going to like say, okay, I want to entertain moral objectivism, like and what C.S. Lewis is saying with the Tao, this idea that like a universal truth that people have independently come to in many different human contexts without crossing, um, and that would be pluralism rather than dogmatism, rather than
Hmm.
there's this strict like code, like explicitly spelled out right wrong. There's no gray areas. Pluralism is this concept that there are what Jonathan Haidt would describe as like taste buds. Like it's not just salty. Like morality isn't just like making
Hmm.
sure things are as salty as possible. They're not just making sure they're as sweet as possible. They're not just making
Hmm.
sure they're as savory as possible. It's this balance between competing um, moralities, or not competing moralities, competing virtues that are sometimes complementary, sometimes contradictory, and there's like a thermostat, like just a perfect reading for each virtue in each situation, and it could be context dependent and dependent on the person, and dependent on a lot of different things. So there. is a right or wrong, but it's really, 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 really hard to discern. And that is like what it means to pursue wisdom. Like pursuing wisdom is pursuing the capacity to discern right from wrong in each of a an infinite number of contexts, experiences, scenarios, if that makes sense. It's like sharpening your sense of how do I identify what is good or bad. Is this
Yeah.
into the weeds too much, or is that kind of
No,
making sense?
no, I think it's helpful. Let me try to throw a practical example to that in the way of provisional nature, and tell me if this is helpful or not helpful, and add to it. So like you go to the local supermarket, and you come out of the supermarket, you're going to your car, you've got a couple bags of groceries, and somebody tackles you and takes your groceries. It's neither good nor bad in the way of what I was initially talking about, like from the perspective of my character is unharmed.
Hmm.
For this individual, well, it was bad. Like that is not moral excellence that we've been talking about.
Hmm.
Um, Now I can have compassion, and I can come from a perspective of love, and maybe this person was trying to feed their family, and we just don't know in terms of the situation, and maybe with that parable, is this good or bad? Well, maybe yes, maybe no, like
Yeah.
whatever it may be. Now, like from the perspective of I come out of the supermarket, another example, and like somebody is you know, has somebody at gunpoint or some sort of like unethical act. Somebody's like trying to carjack someone. And I come up from behind and I tackle this individual, and tell someone to call 911 and all of this. So, like, same act, tackling someone, this and that, but based on the circumstances, two different ways to think about it. And it's like, common sense in a way, but it's like it gets to a little bit of like the provisional
Sure.
nature of these things, like what is courageous, and what might be considered in the virtue of courage in one situation is not in another, and
Sure.
all of that type of stuff.
And to piggyback on that, like courage can be running, can be going to war, can be like running into battle, fighting the Nazis. That was one thing that made World War II, so, a little bit easier to and more unifying than a lot of the wars have been lately. Like it's really clear. Hitler bad. Hitler really bad. We
Yeah,
do need to stop this madman. Like
yeah,
everyone could unite around that. But so courage can be that running into battle, or courage can be Gandhi, like
yeah,
nonviolence.
yeah.
Literally,
Great
literally
example.
turning the other cheek, like putting yourself in scenarios where you are, it's moral courage.
Yeah,
And so yeah, like as you said, the provisional nature of this, I think that's well said.
yeah. I want to touch
Just
on something that you said in our last conversation. I love it. The rationalization rabbit hole. I love
yeah,
I love that phrase, but it makes me think in the way of like I kind of want to have some humility and say that, man, sometimes like actually in practice I lean towards moral relativism in the way of my rationalization rabbit hole that I can go down, and also like the provisional subjective nature, like this example of coming outside the supermarket, of like all of this, like maybe I don't go tackle and intervene this person that's maybe carjacking someone. Maybe I just mind my business and I go over here, and then I do the rationalization rabbit hole where it's like, well, it's like, well, should I have done something? My conscience coming in. It's like, well, no, it's like that's for
that wouldn't
law
be fair to my
enforcement
kid.
profession. Yeah,
That
yeah,
wouldn't be fair to my kids, to
Yeah.
put myself at risk. I should never put myself at risk because, you can do that.
Yeah.
You can figure
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
good people do this. People who believe in
Yeah.
moral objectivism do this all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. But I was thinking like in the way of humility, um, which obviously may be something that comes up throughout like all of these conversations, but also like the pride, the arrogance of like, well, I'm gonna deem what is right and wrong. I'm not gonna look to some sort of religious thing, God, or I'm also not gonna look towards, what culture and evolution, wisdom traditions in general, like C.S. Lewis's The Tao. Well, I'm gonna decide, what is good and what is right and wrong. It's up to me to determine
Mhm,
that from my life.
mhm.
How do we unravel
Which,
that? I guess.
which is really, really, really common, right? Like this assumption that, and I think that's where most, I said it last time, I think that's where most 18, 19-year olds are, kind of at least sometimes fall to, like they're in this position where they're going to be able to decide for themselves what's right and wrong without any external influence, without any reading any great books, or looking at any wisdom traditions from different contexts, thinking about what has been a virtue throughout time. Like you tend to fall into like this utilitarian, as long as it doesn't harm others, which breeds the rationalization rabbit hole,
Mm.
right? Um,
Yeah.
and that is, this ties perfectly into, the comment about, when people claim to be moral subjectivists, they tend to have a sense of moral objectivism anyway, and it tends to be tolerance. Like tolerance is their dogma. If you are intolerant, well, like, whew, there's nothing worse than being an intolerant person, which of course is a lack of tolerance for intolerant people. So, that's
Yeah.
a good way of looking at that. So, so yeah, there are judgments that are going to be made no matter what. In your question, correct me if I'm wrong, is basically like, um, why why would it be better to lean on a wisdom tradition and traditional values, and kind of a the Tao, more or less, throughout time, than to allow yourself to be that 20-something-year-old who is a utilitarian, rationalization rabbit hole sort of guy. Like, oh, I'm going to figure out in every situation, I'll be able to rationalize it. Well, the answer, in my opinion, would be because you will only serve yourself at the end of the day. And
Yeah.
that's what you find.
Yeah. And it connects with something I wrote in the way of um sometimes when we think about character, serving ourselves, self-reliance, we can think of character as like only doing hard things. Like you're no stranger to doing hard things. It's like character development is David Goggins, like period. you know,
Yeah.
why is it more? Why is it a broader thing than that?
Um, like David Goggins is a great example. He does a way into character development is discipline and the capacity to do hard things. I don't
Yeah.
think you can have character development without that. Like discipline is like a portal to more. Um, but like everything can be taken to extreme, and everything needs to be balanced by other virtues. And just doing hard things. The Nazis did really hard things. Being being excellent at a lot of different capacities. Well, the Nazis were really excellent at a lot of different capacities. They did hard things. They were excellent at all these things. They were disciplined. Like, what's missing? There's got to be, you've got to be checked by kind of the whole gamut of virtues, I guess is what I would say there. Um, and um, where that comes from is really the question, right? Um, how do you decide like what is the full spectrum of other things to care about? Um, but yeah, like we can all see that the Nazis, they got up, they trained hard, they were obedient, they were respectful, they did all these things, and yet they did just these atrocious things.
Yeah.
So it has to serve something higher.
Yeah.
Your discipline, your everything has to be funneled towards a greater good,
Yeah.
a sense of what is actually true, good, and beautiful. If it's not serving that, then it's it's you could do it at Star Wars. Darth Vader, he was all these things, but he was not. He was on the dark side.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
um,
And it seems like we can assume that, say, not just like doing hard things, like committing ourselves to some sort of physical like excellence. But I even think like as you're talking about it in the way of say in Eastern traditions, like Buddhist traditions, whether it's like sages that become unbelievably committed, dedicate like decades of their lives to observing the mind and being able to, be liberated from the clinging desire of whatever it may be, and being in the present moment and still do very horrible things to their students, or in
sure.
different like Christian traditions where there's like a commitment to whatever it may be. And there's obviously loads of stories of theologians and different people doing very bad things.
They're devout.
Um,
They're following the rules, and they're not serving the greatest good at the same time.
yeah. Yeah. It's like these different domains where it's like this ethical education, character formation is like requires discipline, requires, all sorts of things, but like is its kind of own domain. Like it's kind of fascinating in the way that um like maybe it makes sense when you think of some sort of examples of Hitler, like you mentioned, and different things. It's like, oh, it's like evil. But yet you can get these people that have kind of committed their lives supposedly to the opposite, find themselves doing very evil things.
Hmm.
It's like
Yeah, yeah.
maybe it connects with the rationalization
Rabbit
rabbit
hole.
hole thing coming in, but it's like this thing of relativism, subjectivism, this thing of like I've heard it. There's a pretty good talk by Jonathan Pajot recently talking about like the highest good, this capital G good. Well, like as we navigate, there's all of these other like goods. It's like safety, pleasure, honor, all these other sort of like, that
Hmm.
aren't really goods, but we start seeing them as goods. And there are things that obviously affect our character. There's things that are, the obviously the opposite of moral excellence can come in. It's like we're easily deluded, easily drawn towards or drawn away from like the highest good, which gets back to the thing of like clarity of standards, like in the way of if
Hmm.
we're committed to some sort of character development, moral objectivism, there is a thing of true good and beautiful, like then okay, what does that look like? I don't know, like the need for clarity, like in my mind, around what are these virtues? What do they look like? Forming ourselves and working lifelong project to conform our lives to these virtues. it's like it's a difficult and tricky thing, I guess, is what I'm saying, and it's kind of fascinating, that's the case.
It's it's endlessly, I mean, it's impossible to know what's best. There's so many things to, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a best and a clear better and worse, if that makes sense. Like we have a target we're aiming for, and we're never going to hit it, but we're better off for having the target, if that makes sense, right? Is that kind of
Yeah, yeah.
capturing what
I
you
I
know?
don't I don't love the word impossible, but in the way of I get what you're saying in the way of are we going to know with complete certainty? But in the way of some of these like the evil acts that I'm talking about,
Oh, sure.
without much reflection and with a bit of clarity in the way of your way of life or looking at any like put a list of any sort of like we know like nope, this is like we know, but it's
Yeah, like don't put people in ovens,
yeah,
just
yeah,
because
yeah,
of the ethnicity that we're born into. Boom, we got
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. Um, but it's like the humility of it though, of like, yeah, I may not know for sure what courage looks like in this particular situation, but
Hmm.
we kind of know what it doesn't.
Hmm.
We kind of know like running the other direction or,
Yes.
whatever it may be. Like in maybe we'll get into I think one of the episodes maybe like on the idea of the common good. Like we kind of know, does this lead towards um is this an act for the common good running in the opposite direction? Like we know that that's not it.
Mhm.
Um but it's so difficult in like the fast pace of daily life in a way for moral excellence, but maybe it's not as challenging and like just thinking about like avoiding vice, as like a strategy.
Is yeah, it's really hard to know because there are situations where you don't run into battle.
Yeah,
This,
yeah, true.
I mean, where the situation does not call for courage necessarily. It calls for another virtue in
Yeah,
prioritized over courage. There's another context where courage is going to be prioritized over justice, say. And
yeah,
so like um it's so hard. And that's what
yeah,
I mean by the
yeah,
impossibility. I don't think it's impossible to make the right decision in any specific case. I think it's impossible to be perfect and
yeah,
always know and have a
yeah,
moral template that is I can write this. I can't give you a formula that you can then apply to each scenario and like, oh,
yeah,
divide this is okay. So in this I need 10 parts courage, 2 parts 2 parts wisdom or whatever it is, like
yeah, yeah,
all in there all the time, and it's really hard to discern. And yet that doesn't mean that there isn't a right and wrong.
yeah, yeah,
And it's why these discussions and why discussion is so important. And that's come down in our tradition throughout the ages. It's like the Socratic dialogue. It's why that was brilliant and life changing is
yeah,
because it is a method of trying to come to truth and trying to overcome the implicit bias that plagues us all, and those cognitive biases that we can't ever discover without the help of other people.
yeah,
um and so I guess that's what I mean by impossible. Like it is
yeah,
impossible to always know
yeah,
to become perfect, um
yeah.
and to see that.
Yeah, it's like the thing of like the pursuit of excellence. It's about the pursuit. Like it doesn't
Yes.
mean, yeah, it doesn't get into like the toxic perfectionism type of stuff. Which is often said is like that's the enemy of the good. So it's such like a good point of like, no, it's not about that.
Hmm.
Um Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah.
Our time flew by. I could talk to you for hours upon hours about this stuff. But as we wrap up, let me read this one passage that I love. I'm sure you've heard, and probably many listeners have heard from Lewis's Abolition of Man. He says, "In all times, such as the tragic comedy of our situation, we continue to clamor for those very qualities we are rendering impossible. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that what our civilization needs is more drive or dynamism or self sacrifice or creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst." I love that. Love that
Oh, it's
passage.
amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
And it's like those very qualities, like as he said, it's like one of those, maybe surprisingly, is like just like a deep belief in the true good and beautiful. Like a deep belief in it. It does to me feel like it's on some sort of spectrum. You know, it's like we can really get that in our bones, like a commitment to the capital G good, and be really mindful that it's like there are forces that want to compete with it and want to pull it down, and our own human nature leads us to rabbit hole rationalize. Go down it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's this, but he's so spot on. There's this tendency, and I think it's even more pronounced now. Like most of what he talks about is much more pronounced now in society,
Yeah.
especially post the technology. He's writing before everyone has a television in their house, delivering them, a million advertising messages a day that are, kind of all formed around the idea of, not all, but many formed around the idea of moral relativism. You know, treat yourself, you deserve it. There's, don't let anyone tell you you don't. Like, there's no, don't listen to the judgment. Don't listen to the haters. Like, you deserve this. It's kind of like this underlying ethos of society. And he's writing before that. He kind of saw
Yeah.
what was before that. Um, and I think that a good way of thinking of that, we're treating all the symptoms without treating the cause.
Hmm.
We're looking at mass mental health crisis without realizing like the thing that binds community. We're talking about how people need more connection, they need more friends, they need more. They need all these things that are going unmet in our world. Like, they need more health, they need more that, and it's like, well, like, underneath that all is it's like the pursuit of what is true, good, and beautiful. If that was still there, primary to society, to civilization, to our culture, then like the connection with the people around you would be there in spades. The mental health, mental flourishing would be there in spades. And there's a lot of research really to support that. There's a ton of research to support. Jonathan Haidt makes the case over and over and over again that morality is this human superpower that allows connection. And without it, you have individualism, um, like hyper individualism, rationalization rabbit hole, the ability to do whatever you want, but the inability to connect, because we connect over common passion, which is rooted in like firmly held beliefs around what's true, good, and beautiful. So I think
Hmm.
that's just what C.S. Lewis is saying. I think is brilliant, and we've seen it. Uh, you know, Everything he's speaking of has been we've gotten to a point where it's all been amplified. Um,
Yeah. I love it. That's a great way to wrap it up, Shane. And you talk about a lot of these ideas in your Substack and in your book, Setting the Bar. We'll link it all in the show notes so it's easy to find for the listeners. But again, man, super grateful for you committing the time to do this. I think this is a really important topic to think about, having like a series of a half a dozen episodes on this similar topic of character development. I'm excited to see, how it turns out at the end, and what the listeners think of it as well. So good stuff.
Yes.
Thank you so much, man.
Hey, thanks so much. This has been a blast.